I'm Rosalie Weinberg. I'm on the program committee with Elaine Zeminski, and we're very pleased to have with us today Bridget Marshall, and she's going to talk to us today about disturbing women and Mary Webster, the Witch of Hadley. Please give her a warm welcome.
So glad to be here. I live in Lowell, Massachusetts now, which I also love, but we lived in Northampton before that, and we miss Western Mass a lot, so I'm very grateful to you all for inviting me and having me come talk about one of my favorite witches, Mary Webster. How many of you have heard of Mary Webster? You maybe know a little bit about Mary Webster. I saw a student elementary school project poster over there on Mary Webster, which is super exciting for me. I love to see that. I was going to do some slides originally and have a projector, and then I thought, I'm talking about a witch and I'm going to be in her hometown, and I don't know that I want to tempt fate with like what might happen with technology, because technology always gets messed up anyway. So I went low tech. I've got a handout. I think there's should be enough coming around for most people, or you can share with a neighbor, and that'll just give you a little bit of some resources you can look at, and some I'm going to be talking about a lot of different sources, so if you get lost in the, wait, which person said what, this might help you. And on the back there's a terrible poem. It's really, really terrible, so I apologize for spreading bad poetry, but it's useful, and I'll get to that towards the end. So, I'm here today to talk about witches, in big, scare quotation marks. I'm not going to do this every time, but keep in mind, every time I say the word witches, big square quotation, scare quotes around it. And that is to emphasize there were no witches in New England, okay? There were no women running around in pointy black hats with green faces. There were no women riding around on broomsticks. There were no women casting spells over bubbling cauldrons, right? That is fake news. All right. There were, however, women who were accused of being witches for a wide variety of reasons. Some of them were outsider women, whether they were poor, old, single, or widowed, who lived on the margins of their community, sometimes literally, and they attracted the spite of their neighbors. Some of them were younger, married, even well-to-do women, who attracted the jealousy of their community. Some of them were even men. In Puritan New England, which is to say the white English settler colonies formed in this area of Massachusetts all the way up to Maine, they believed that their communities had been infiltrated by the devil, who was actively enlisting women, men, even children, and on at least one occasion a dog, to sign his black book and join his league against their god and country. New Englanders brought their belief in witches with them from their homes in England. Indeed, the witchcraft belief was particularly strong in Essex, England, the original home of many of the settlers who came to this particular area. And these beliefs became even more important as the colonists faced a really harsh and challenging life here in a new land. Crops failed, livestock died, children became ill and also died. Native Americans engaged the colonists in warfare, often inflicting severe damages, though to be clear, they were here first, and they were the victims of far more egregious incursions made by the colonists. But if the Puritans were God's ordained people, why, oh why, were these terrible things happening to them? It's in this intense cauldron of stress, anxiety, and deprivation, with limited scientific and medical knowledge, that a profound belief that they were practicing the one true, pure religion, that a belief in witches, a belief that some in our own community might be in league with the devil, comes to actually make a lot of sense. So before we jump into details, understand that no matter how wild the claims are about these witches, or one witch in particular, there are several key elements underlying this community's beliefs. First, a lack of scientific and medical knowledge to explain things like disease, death, or other phenomenon. Two, a strong belief in their God and in the active involvement of the devil. And three, a daily life that really required constant physical labor to maintain their basic needs. So we want to think of that as sort of underlying construction that sort of try to understand their mindset and why they would fall to believe these things that we look at today and say, oh, that's just absurd. So today's talk will focus specifically on Mary Webster, and I'll also try to sketch the larger context of her world in terms of the community where she lived, right here, and the beliefs that they held. Another important aspect of this talk will be the fake news problem that I alluded to in my opening. Mary Webster was definitely a real person, but information about her is very sketchy. We have some records that help us draw a rough outline, but many other records are missing. We don't know if they existed to begin with, they don't know if they were lost or destroyed, accidentally or on purpose, we just don't know. We don't have any private diaries or insider information, and as we know now, what we wish Mary Webster had carefully written down memos to herself to remind her of all the details of every single interaction she had. That would have been really, really helpful. But lacking that, we have a lot we have to piece together without those first-person details. We do have several historians who have taken this on, though it's just not clear if they had more information than we do. Were there trial transcripts that have been lost since they were able to look at them? Was Cotton Mather, who we'll get to in a bit, actually using those trial transcripts? And how much of what these historians report might actually be from some oral stories that could have some validity, that may actually have some truthful bits in it, but as we all know, in the retelling that happens in any small community, how much are those things embellished, and then the historians write them down and they take on a different sort of meaning. Throughout this talk, I'll be inserting sort of asterisks, and you can take a look at your handout to help see where these are, to note the level of reliability of these sources. So I've tried to give you a list of the timeline of events and the timeline of when the sources that we have were written, so how close they were. So again, that idea that the closer it is to the original time period, perhaps the more accurate something might be, and as we go through time, we see some loss and some changes in what the records tell us. And I'll also try to highlight some spots where I think there may actually be more information out there that maybe potentially we'll be able to gather and fill in some gaps. As always, history is a work in progress, subject to revision as we find new details and debunk old myths. To step back for a moment and consider the big picture, keep in mind that in 17th century New England, witchcraft accusations were actually fairly common. Every town seems to have had at least one official accusation, and no doubt many more had sort of local legends and talk and rumors about the witches in their town. Modern-day readers of colonial witchcraft trials see much of the evidence of witchcraft as totally preposterous: screaming girls, mysterious pins, the witch cake, or other fanciful ideas that appear in many stories of the witchcraft trials. But the colonists seemed quite certain that justice was served by their trials and executions. Seeing their confidence is perhaps doubly confounding when today we are faced with such limited evidence with which to reconstruct and evaluate what actually happened back then. For most cases, the court records of witchcraft just lead to more questions. Perhaps no story of New England witchcraft is more curious than that of Mary Webster of Hadley. And a brief thumbnail sketch, and then I can dive into the details. In 1683, she was accused of and tried for witchcraft, but was officially acquitted by the court. And just a footnote there, the vast majority of cases pre-Salem are acquitted. They don't convict. In general, Massachusetts, all the colonists, they're not convicting in courts. That just isn't happening until things go really haywire in Salem, which is a different talk that we could talk about later. Jim has his shirt on with all of the Salem. So maybe he could get up and share some on that. Like many of those acquitted, though, Webster's status as an accused witch was enough of a mark of her witchery, and the year after her acquittal, so to be clear, it's an entire year after the court has officially said not guilty, her neighbors try to hang her anyway. In the most remarkable twist, the hanging was unsuccessful. So if there's anything that's going to make people think you're a witch, I would suggest it is probably not dying in such a public, dramatic sort of way. So at this point, I'll try to dig into more of what we know about Mary. That's sort of the headline, the story. That's definitely the clickbait story if we were reading this on the internet, right? And then we're going to dig in and see what do we know, how do we separate out maybe the truth from the legend, and see what we can figure out about Mary. So yeah, carry on, dive in. Great. So who was Mary Webster? We know that Mary Webster's maiden name was Reeve, and that she was probably born between 1617 and 1624 in England. We don't know much about her prior to her marriage to William Webster in 1670. However, we know a lot about William Webster and his family. More on that shortly. William was born in England in 1614. He's the third of 9 children born to Agnes Smith and John Webster. Pause. Yes, that John Webster, right? You Hadleyites know your John Webster? Governor of Connecticut in 1656, leaves Connecticut in 1659 over religious differences, and becomes one of the early residents right here in Hadley, sort of a founder, a light of the community. But he lives here for less than 2 years. He dies in 1661. Agnes Webster is his wife, Mary's mother-in-law. She dies in Hadley in 1667. But they are a well-to-do family involved with the town government and the town founding. So how exactly William, Mary's husband, falls from being the son of the governor and of a magistrate in Hadley to relying on the charity of Hadley, which is something that we know from later records, it's not entirely clear to me. It's one of the many pieces I'd like to try to tease out a little bit more if I can. Particularly given that William made off relatively well compared to his siblings in terms of the legacy left by John Webster. In John Webster's will, he leaves money to 5 of his 6 surviving children. His son Matthew gets 10 pounds, daughter Marsh gets 20 pounds, daughter Markham gets 40 pounds, son Thomas gets 50 pounds, and William gets 70 pounds. So, it would seem that he's doing well, perhaps a favored son. So he receives the most of the 5 children who are named. However, Webster's wife Agnes got the house, and I love this, his comely furniture. He must have had very lovely furniture. Reading these wills is really a hoot. Perhaps the real problem is, though, that John made Robert, his other son Robert, the sole and full executor of the estate. So perhaps that is actually cutting him out. He gets the cash, but not the larger bit of the estate. The will also notes, "My lot at the new plantation, with the accommodations thereunto belonging, I give to my sons, William and Thomas, upon condition of their inhabiting there, as I myself was engaged to do." This always leaves me asking, what the heck happened to that lot at New Plantation? Did William and Thomas not get along? Were they not able to agree to how to live there? We don't know what happened there, but we do know that very soon after this, he ends up living on the charity of the town in a small house by the middle highway, and living without resources, apparently, asking for the charity of the town. So William Webster and his wife Mary live in a house provided by the community of Hadley, and the community of Hadley didn't seem too happy about this. So let's take a look at some of the sources and see some of the background details that we're able to figure out from there. Sources on Webster's case are notoriously difficult to pin down, but they'll make for very entertaining reading. The record of the Court of Assistants provides the most reliable information, but it's really, really lacking in details. Several histories, including Cotton Mather's memorable provinces relating to witchcraft and possessions, and his Magdalena Christi Americana, Thomas Hutchinson's History of the Colony and Province of Massachusetts Bay, Sylvester Judd's History of Hadley, and Samuel Drake's Annals of Witchcraft in New England provide considerable embellishment, and I would stress embellishment, and are, I would say, less reliable, since none of these authors were present at the events in the Hadley trial, or later on. Especially in the case of Judd and Drake, much of the information is based on local lore. And we know this with Judd all over the time, but he also was collecting a lot of stories, so he's an interesting figure, but some of his stories, it's not quite clear what pieces of historical facts he's pinning them to. They may very well have been tinged with prejudice and perhaps exaggeration over time. According to Drake, in his Annals of Witchcraft, Webster's case, quote, is said to be the most notable of any that ever occurred in the county of Hampshire, and Judd claims that Mary Webster was the most notable witch in Hampshire County. Drake adds the detail that Mary was supposed to have made league with the devil and could ride through the air on broomsticks or without them. Again, Drake is the only historian who includes a remark about broomsticks, and whether he's recounting that as truth or whether he's sort of perhaps, maybe there's some irony in that he's saying, well, she was supposed to have gone through with broomsticks or without them. It's sometimes unclear on what his tone is, but Drake is definitely the only one who mentions broomsticks, so we're done with broomsticks for the rest of the talk. So noting just those concerns and keeping those things in mind, let's pursue what Judd has to say and his interpretation. So Sylvester Judd explains in his History of Hadley that Mary Reeve married William Webster in 1670, this is true, when he was 53 years old and she probably some years younger. Not that much younger, though. Judd cites several reasons for the Websters' problems with the locals, including the fact that they were poor and required financial assistance from the town. He also says, quote, Mary Webster's temper, which was not the most placid, was not improved by poverty and neglect. She used harsh words when offended. I'm really glad there's a lot of women in the audience, because that ladies, you're with me. All right, so Judd further supposes, this is Judd, that despised and sometimes ill-treated, she soured with the world and rendered spiteful towards some of her neighbors. In truth, we have no testimony from Webster herself about her feelings towards her community or her situation. In any case, though, it does seem clear that the Websters were of the lowest socioeconomic class, which in many readings of witchcraft trials, such as Paul Boyer and Steve Nissenbaum's Salem Possessed or Carol Carson's Devil in the Shape of a Woman, this is a very common factor, being of a lower socioeconomic class. Though not in all cases, but is certainly very common. All accounts claim that Mary Webster was an unpleasant character, widely disliked in the community. Drake somewhat sympathetically explains, quote, "Poverty is discouraging, and it is intimated that it did not improve the temper of Mary Webster. It is also intimated she became spiteful and looked upon all about her as enemies and acted accordingly." The fact that Webster looked on her neighbors as enemies seems reasonable in the face of the treatment she received at their hands. Most accounts indicate that the supposed victims of her witchcraft took immediate action against her. Drake explains, quote, "Cattle refused to draw as they approached her house. Horses balked and could not be driven past her door. In such cases, drivers would enter the house and beat her, or threaten to do so, and then she generally let them pass." Judd similarly recounts, quote, "The teamsters used to go in the house and whip or threaten to whip her, and she would let the teams pass." Whether Mary was the cause of the problems in transportation near her home or not, it is notable that the men were not afraid to threaten or actually physically harm her, despite her supposed witchcraft powers, which seems a strange break in the logic there to me. Drake further explains, and he's repeating Judd's claims, that, quote, "On one occasion she overturned a load of hay as it was about to pass, and the man in charge of it entered the house to whip her, but in the meantime his load of hay was placed right side up by an invisible hand." One might wonder whether men started to assume that Mary would interfere and perhaps simply began preemptively entering her home and beating her or threatening her in order to prevent her casting these spells with her invisible hand. Some of the more colorful anecdotes make claims that are less easily explained, with one tale in Drake's account says, quote, "At another time, by looking at a child in a cradle at a neighbor's house, she caused it to ascend to the chamber floor 3 successive times when no visible hand touched it." So she's like throwing a baby on the ground, but not physically doing it. It seems, again, one of these things I can't explain. Many of the testimonies will have these sort of inexplicable pieces. It surely sounds supernatural, but it's not clear who the source is. Again, we don't have a specific example or person that this is pinned to. The Websters themselves, though, had no children, so perhaps this added to local concerns and suspicions. The majority of stories of bewitching seem to involve what we would probably today call coincidence. And here's an example. "Once a hen came down somebody's chimney and was somewhat scalded in a pot, which happened to be over the fire. It was found that Mary Webster was suffering from a scald at the same time." Right? That's like an open and shut case. Like a hen fell down, and then she's got a scald. So again, these coincidences that we see, that they would all be sort of strung together, again, as evidence that she was a witch. So in any case, it seems there's a lot of ill will towards Mary, and it came as no surprise then that she's called to court in Northampton in 1683 to account for her behavior. So back to court records. So those are all the sort of vague things that are claimed after the fact. Here's what we have in the court records. Mary Webster appeared before the court at Northampton on March 27th, 1683. Court records indicate that those present included John Pynchon of Springfield, Peter Tilton and Philip Smith of Hadley, William Clark and Aaron Cook of Northampton, and Samuel Partridge of Hadley, who served as clerk. The record provides limited detail, indicating only that she was, quote, "under strong suspicion of having familiarity with the devil or of using witchcraft," and that many testimonies were brought against her. If those testimonies were written down, and we don't know that they have not survived, or at least to date haven't been found. But since cases of witchcraft were beyond the scope of the local court at Northampton, and this happens in a couple of other cases, Mary Parsons, which is another witch you may have heard of, she's a witch in Northampton. Cases of witchcraft were beyond the scope of the court at Northampton, so they send it to the Court of Assistance in Boston. The court here sends her to the jail in Boston, along with, they say, all the evidences related to the case. Again, that would make me think that there's written evidences, but we don't have those. On May 22nd, 1683, Mary Webster appears before Governor Bradstreet, Deputy Governor Danforth, and the 9 assistants at the court in Boston, where she is indicted. The court record explains that she was accused of, quote, "not having the fear of God before her eyes, and being instigated by the devil, hath entered into covenant and had familiarity with him in the shape of a warrenage, and had her imps sucking her, and teats or marks found on her secret parts, as in and by several testimonies may appear contrary to the peace of our sovereign lord, the king, his crown and dignity, the laws of God and this jurisdiction." They're really fired up about this. A couple notes on that. So you heard this, she had her secret parts are searched. This may be something, if you've read anything on Salem witch trials, they do this search for witch marks on a witch's body. Basically, they believe that witches had familiars. These would be animals, cats, sometimes mice, and in this case, a warrenage, which best we can figure is the Fisher cat, actually, is probably what he was referring to, or what's being referred to. It's a little tough to figure out. So they believe that the witch could send her familiar out to do her bidding, right, to cause mischief in the community, and that when it came back, it was sucking on her like a child, and so she would have witch teats at any part of her body. Of course, if you just want to look at your arms and see, do you have a funny looking mole or a freckle or anything like that, that could have been something that was, or a birthmark, that would be your witch's teat, that you were somehow nursing your familiar, and that would have been a sign of your witchcraft. So keep that in mind. Again, unfortunately, we've not yet discovered those evidences, and we don't have a lot of information to go on about what was presented to the jury or what facts they actually had to judge. Judd supplements the limited court records with notations from the colony's treasurer's books, which indicate the cost of Mary Webster's court case. Bringing down Mary Webster from Hadley to prison was £5. Witnesses about Goodwife Webster, £12, 15 shillings and 2 pence. Robert Earl for keeping Mary Webster in Boston, £4, and cash for carrying Mary Webster to Hadley, £2. So it was a total of £23, 15 shillings and 2 pence expended on the Boston trial of Mary Webster. And with that, the official, oh wait, did I just skip? Oh, sorry, I skipped the actual verdict, right, sorry. I was so excited about telling you about the warrenage. So 4 months after they submit the indictment, on September 4th, 1683, we just find out to which indictment Mary responded, making no exception against any of the jury, leaving herself to be tried by God and country. After the indictment and evidences in the case were read, committed to the jury, and are on file, they brought in their verdict and found her not guilty. Again, over and over again, pre-Salem, this is what we see, right? They are confirmed not guilty, and they are sent back to their communities. And it seems this is where her problems truly began. We know she returned to Hadley, but we don't have any other information about the details of that. And this is really where that whole legend thing kicks in. Perhaps in a very early example of Western Massachusetts being really unhappy with decisions made in Boston, we know that is still the case, the residents of Hadley disagreed with the Boston court's verdict. Just 1 year after Mary Webster is declared not guilty by the Boston court, in the winter of 1684-85, Lieutenant Philip Smith of Hadley becomes gravely ill, and he dies actually on January 10th of 1685. Smith was a prominent member of the Hadley community, and in fact, he had served on that Hampshire County court that sent Mary Webster's case to Boston. So he's a member of the court here, and so could, in some ways, be seen as being a part of the reason Mary's trial is continued. Apparently, Mary was suspected of causing Smith's illness, and some residents attempted to hang her for it. At this point, the explanation of what happened varies depending on the source. So I'll talk a little bit about what the different versions tell us. The key document for details on Mary's witchery is Cotton Mather's Memorable Provinces, published in 1689. Later historians seem to rely on him almost exclusively for the details. Drake thinks Mather is a great historian and calls him contemporaneous with the events and well-informed with particulars. But it's really important to note that Mather was not actually present for the events, and more importantly, that he had a very strong reason to represent witchcraft as in as frightening a form as possible. As Drake later admits, quote, "It should be remembered that nearly all of Mather's accounts came to him at least secondhand, and often perhaps third or fourth, from idle heads, all lovers of the marvelous, ready at all times, especially in the night, to believe the air full of ill-shapen monsters, bearing commissions from the devil, to enlist followers of whom he might make witches and send them forth to vex and torment mankind." Despite such misgivings about Mather's motivation, Drake and others continue to report Mather's findings really without much critique, and they often just recopy several paragraphs from Mather and plop it in as if it's evidence. And it seems to be more important because it's been repeated so many times, but again, I want to stress we don't have any documentation on this. So Mather's Memorable Provinces tells the story, and he tells the same story, a few variations again, in Magdalena Christi Americana in 1702. From the opening of the text, he makes it clear where he stands on the events in Hadley. So again, this is Mather. Mr. Philip Smith, aged about 50 years, a son of eminently virtuous parents, a deacon of the church at Hadley, a member of our general court, an associate in our county court, a selectman for the affairs of the town, a lieutenant in the troop, and which crowns all, a man for devotion and gravity, and all that was honest, exceeding exemplary, such a man in the winter of the year 1684 was murdered with a hideous witchcraft, which filled all those parts with astonishment. right? This is like better than the Comey memos, right? This is like really, this is building it up. It's building up, right, the drama for this. So obviously Mather is using the case of Philip Smith in his ongoing fight against the powers of darkness that he sees as very much alive in roaming New England. Furthermore, he really stresses that high standing of Philip Smith, socially and morally, who is the victim here, and he claims that Mary Webster had it out for Smith. Quote, Smith was concerned about relieving the indigencies of a wretched woman in the town who, being dissatisfied at some of his just cares about her, expressed herself unto him in such a manner that he declared himself apprehensive of receiving mischief at her hands. Mather's account, again, really stresses that difference of Philip Smith's standing and Mary Webster's standing. And also, it's important to note, he never names Mary Webster in his recounting. He just refers to her as that woman, that witch. So it's very clear that his story is about Smith and him being a victim of the witchcraft. Her particular name, any interest in her real story isn't of consequence for Mather. So, Philip Smith is clearly ill, and we do know that he died. He's a real person, so again, sort of separating those things out. Mather describes Smith's illness at great length, and perhaps most importantly, Smith's own suspicions about what had caused this illness. Again, that thing I mentioned all the way at the beginning, they don't know why diseases are happening. They don't know why people are getting ill. Symptoms could be really inexplicable and confusing to them. So this is in Mather's account. About the beginning of January, he began to be very valetudinarious. In raptures, he would cry out, "Lord, stay thy hand, it is enough, it is more than thy frail servant can bear." But in the midst of these things, he uttered still a hard suspicion that the ill woman who had threatened him had made impressions on him. While he yet remained of a sound mind, he very sedately but very solemnly charged his brother to look well after him. "Be sure," he said, "to have a care for me, for you shall see strange things. There shall be a wonder in Hadley. I shall not be dead when it is thought I am." This charge he pressed over and over, and afterwards became delirious. I would suggest that he was delirious before that all started. So from this description, it's obvious that Smith was really suffering in the extreme. And this visible struggle that he was enduring was no doubt very concerning for his family and friends, the people who were watching this illness. This delirious claim that there shall be a wonder in Hadley perhaps seems over the top to us today, but it really seems like it was genuinely terrifying to his community. His claim that I shall not be dead when it is thought I am is particularly chilling when we consider that people sometimes were declared dead when they were not at this time period, right? Again, lacking some of the details, perhaps they're comatose. But I also can't help but see a biblical reference here, and I have questions about whether did Smith feel that way? Did the people watching him feel that way? Or is Mather kind of inserting some of this after the fact? Again, this is our only account of these things that supposedly Smith was saying. Mather was not there. To what extent is he adding in what he needs to add in to make the case the way he really wants to see it, to make it more dramatic? Whatever the cause, Smith was suffering fits and delirium, sure to frighten not only him, but also his nurses and watchers. Several of his symptoms echo those that appear in other witchcraft cases. Mather claims that he had speech incessant and voluble beyond all imagination, and this in diverse tones and sundry voices and various languages. Additionally, he cried out not only of sore pain, but also of sharp pins pricking of him, sometimes in his toe, sometimes in his arm, as if there had been hundreds of them. But the people upon search never found any more than one. Again, I pause with this, well, why was there even one in the sick man's bed? It's a little bit strange, these details. The pins in particular, if you've read anything about Salem, you know the girls had pins. Sometimes it seems that they were using them themselves. Sometimes they said they were feeling pinpricks, and there's a lot of different theories on why. It could be, again, his illness is just giving him, whether it's hallucinations or actual feelings. Perhaps he has a rash. There's so many possibilities and questions here. So the pins remind me of Salem. Also like the Salem accusers, Smith claimed to see an apparition of his tormentor when no one else in the room could. Quote, in his distresses, this is Mather, he exclaimed very much upon the woman aforementioned, and he never says Mary Webster's name, naming her and some others and saying, "Do you not see them? There they stand." And I should note that bit about some others being with Mary Webster leaves me wondering who else might have been caught up in this at the time. According to Mather, the strangeness was not limited to Smith's person. There were continuous strange occurrences just simply in his room. Pots of medicine were emptied. Maybe he was taking them when they weren't there. Audible scratchings were made about the bed when his hands and feet lay wholly still. I live in an old Massachusetts house. We definitely have weird scratchings at night from the mice that are clearly in my house. But again, I always find myself undercutting a lot of this testimony and thinking that's absurd. But that mindset where they really believe, they're true believers at this point. And then there's some that I can't explain. Most spectacularly, they beheld fire sometimes on the bed. When the beholders began to discourse of it, it vanished away. So again, that spectrum of, I'm not sure how to weigh some of these claims of evidence. Diverse people felt something stir in the bed at a considerable distance from the man. It seemed as big as a cat, but they could never grasp it. So they think there's a familiar perhaps running around in the room, which again sort of adds to that idea that there's a witch involved. As if to bolster his case for the bewitching of Smith, Mather also mentions curious details about his corpse after he succumbs to illness. According to Mather, they, quote, found a swelling on one breast which rendered it like a woman's. His privates were wounded or burned. On his back, besides bruises, there were several pricks or holes as if done with awls or pins. Again, all of this strangeness I can't account for, but they're really concerned about what has happened to him. The strange markings on his body are compounded by the fact that the body didn't quite seem dead, again, which he had previously suggested he wouldn't be dead. Mather notes, after the opinion of all had pronounced him dead, his countenance continued as lively as if he had been alive, his eyes closed in a slumber, and his nether jaw not falling down. At this point, of course, I'm imagining that he perhaps is not dead. Later on, when they take him out of his bed, they, quote, found him still warm, though the season of cold was as cold as had been known in any age. Whether Smith was actually alive and in some kind of coma is not something we can know, unfortunately, at this point. But in any case, this death was not seen as something that was normal for the time, and they can't explain why this is happening. His friends and family are distraught. After his body is moved, there then seems to be a very swift degeneration. Quote, on Monday morning, they found the face extremely tumefied and discolored. 'Twas as black and blue, and fresh blood seemed to run down his cheek. Sorry, it's a little gruesome, yeah. Okay, so I think that's as gruesome as it gets. They can't really figure out what is happening here, and they have a lot of concerns. Apparently, after his body is dead, and they're sure it's dead, diverse noises were heard in the room where the corpse lay, the clattering of chairs and stools, whereof no account could be given. Again, this is very ghost story, sort of spooky, and again, these are all Mather's words, and he's definitely adding a lot of detail, I would suggest. These symptoms surely would have been disturbing to anyone. In the 17th century, with limited understanding of natural processes of death, disease, and decay, that would be concerning. But also, in this culture, the only reason one would get sick in such a painful and visible way is because of punishment from God, and we already know Philip Smith is like the best, right? Or the involvement of the devil. If bad things were happening to good people, then witchcraft was definitely afoot. Mather ends his discussion with the sentence, quote, upon the whole it appeared unquestionable that witchcraft had brought a period unto the life of so good a man. In Mather's version of the story, there's no question that Smith died from bewitching. And in the eyes of the community, it seems that the bewitching was being done by Mary Webster. While witnessing the terrible trials of Smith, the community apparently wanted to find some way to ease his pains, and who wouldn't, given what we've heard in the description. Mather explains that some of the witnesses to Smith's outcries tried to test the theory that Webster was involved in an interesting way. This is Mather. Quote, some of the young men in town, being out of their wits at the strange calamities thus upon one of their most beloved neighbors, went 3 or 4 times to give disturbance unto the woman thus complained of. And all the while they were disturbing of her, he was at ease, and slept as a weary man. Yea, these were the only times that they perceived him to take any sleep at all in his illness. What exactly did it mean to disturb the suspected witch? We don't know. That's the earliest mention that we have of this disturbing happening, and that's as detailed as it gets. She was disturbing. The practice of beating or restraining a suspected witch to prevent her from further mischief is a common occurrence. We see this in Salem. Similar activities are referenced in Salem. In referring to the disturbing of Mary Webster, Thomas Hutchinson, in his History of Massachusetts Bay Colony, this is a little bit later in the timeline, he describes what we have from Mather this way, quote, while Philip Smith lay ill, a number of brisk lads tried an experiment upon the old woman. Having dragged her out of the house, they hung her up until she was near dead, let her down, rolled her in snow some time, and at last buried her in it and left her there. Mather never specifically mentioned a hanging, and Hutchinson is really the first mention of with that much detail and of a hanging at all. Other than the disturbing is the only thing that we know from Mather. Judd and Drake's versions both follow from Hutchinson, but the source of the story really remains unconfirmed. Hanging seems likely in a way, given the fact that hanging was the preferred punishment for witches in the American colonies, as evidenced in particular in Salem. But it's also possible that the disturbance was a beating or a whipping or something else entirely. William Webster, her husband, was actually still alive at this time. What was his role in this? Did Mary have any defenders? The accounts are silent on all of this, painting a really distressing picture of what Mary might have endured at the hands of an angry mob. We just don't know. Mary Webster, however, did indeed survive, whatever that disturbance was. She lived for another, actually 11 years, and she was probably 70 or so when she died, in peace, I hope, in 1696. Thus, if you know your dates there, she actually lived to see what happens in Salem in 1692, and so we might think about how that must feel when she escaped the news to see all these other folks who don't. Many post-Mather versions of the story are less friendly towards Smith and his comrades than Mather was. For instance, Thomas Hutchinson, writing in his History of the Colony and Providences, describes Smith as a hypochondriac person who fancied himself under an evil hand and suspected a woman. And it is with some apparent glee that Hutchinson reports the outcome. It happened that she survived and the melancholy man died. Drake also casts aspersions on the behavior of the witch hunters and points out what he perceives to be their foolishness. So this is Drake. He says, "It will be remembered that in the narrative just extracted, mention is made of some young men who went 3 or 4 times to give disturbance to Mary Webster. It is said by a reliable historian," and here Drake is referring back to Hutchinson, "that the young miscreants went to her house, dragged her out, and hung her up till she was almost dead, cut her down, and then buried her in the snow, leaving her for dead. But by a miracle she survived this barbarity. Still more miraculous it was that the sick man was greatly relieved. The tormentors must have been infidels of the worst type." So he's suggesting that the people who went to do this were infidels of the worst type, else they would never have dared to molest someone who they believed to be a witch, and hence able to afflict them as sorely as Mr. Smith was afflicted. Again, this is the logic that I was troubled by as well. "And yet they doubtless believed that a witch could take off her shoes and go through a keyhole to torment whoever she pleased. Such are the inconsistencies of believers in witchcraft." So again, this is Drake, who's retelling the story, but with a little bit more skepticism and questioning that logic. Drake's text takes the boys to task for their questionable logic. Whether the community really believed Mary was a witch or simply disliked her and looked for an excuse to get rid of her is certainly a question we can't answer. But ultimately, Mary Webster triumphed over them, and one has to imagine that she remained a feared figure in the community for those long 11 years that she lived afterwards. I'm guessing no one begrudged giving her money to continue in her home. So Mary Webster's troubles are not amusing. In some ways we laugh, there are some chuckles in some of the details there. But it is enjoyable to imagine the community's displeasure at finding that they have this death-defying witch among them. I'll talk a little bit about 2 poems that I think also bring some other interpretations to life. As I said, we have limited historical records, so we end up turning to fiction sometimes or to poetry to try to figure out, what pieces are we missing, what perspectives might we imagine to be involved here. So I've got 2 poems from 2 different periods about Mary Webster. So in September of 1893, Julia Taft Bain publishes a poem, it's on the back of your handout, in New England Magazine. It's called Molly Webster, and it imagines Mary Webster as a fearsome woman who still has a hold over Hadley, again in 1893. It's a 40-line poem of rhyming couplets. It is written in a faux, I want to stress, it's faux antique, right? They didn't actually write or speak like that in 1893 when she's writing this poem. The speaker of Bain's poem is a Hadleyite, and Julia Taft Bain is a local. And the speaker of her poem says, "Heard ye e'er of Molly Webster the Hadley witch? Heavy her curse hath lain upon Hadley, feared on by poor and rich." The speaker insists that Webster was a powerful witch and that she is still much feared in the town. In one particularly notable line, the speaker proposes an explanation for her acquittal by the Boston courts. She says, "Pray God it was not for her bright black eyes and her long curling hair." Yeah. Webster's appearance is never mentioned in the court records. We know nothing about what she actually looked like. This detail really seems to be from the imagination of the poet. The poem asks for the audience's interventions. Pray, Christian people who hear this tale, whoever ye may be, pray for the peace of Hadley, for sorely tried are we. And the final invocation says, God keep us all from savages, God keep us all from worse, the idle sport of wicked friends and Molly Webster's curse. I've never heard about Molly Webster's curse other than in this poem. I really think Julia Taft-Bain's just having some fun here. She does footnote the poem to indicate that her version of the story comes from Mather, and the poem does seem to have imbibed Mather's sense of terror about the witch. At the other end of the spectrum, from those who feared Mary's mysterious power, are those who admire her strength and endurance in the face of colonial intolerance. One of Mary Webster's descendants is the now well-known Canadian novelist and poet Margaret Atwood. In an address in 1980, when she received the Radcliffe Alumni Medal, Atwood said of Mary Webster, "She is my favorite ancestor, more dear to my heart even than the privateers and the massacred French Protestants, and if there's one thing I hope I've inherited from her, it's her neck." This can't be Margaret Atwood. She's amazing. So Atwood dedicated her 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which everyone's talking about now, and the Netflix show based on it. She dedicated that novel to Mary Webster, and also used her ancestor as the subject of a poem called Half-Hanged Mary, which appeared in her collection, Mourning in the Burned House. And I haven't copied that here because it's still under copyright, and you can look it up, certainly in a book or online. I printed this one out because it's outside of the Julia Taft-Bain poem is out of copyright, but I definitely recommend that you look it out. I'll read a little bit of it to you. It's a long poem, but really, really wonderful. Atwood's poem is divided into sections, each chronicling an hour of Mary's hanging from the tree, and she imagines it happening from 7 at night and concluding at 8 the next morning, which is really compelling to just imagine what might be happening here. And this is where I stress, we have the court records and details and testimony, we have the colorful things that Mather has told us, but Atwood really tries to imagine, to put herself in that mind frame of where Atwood was, of where Webster was. Obviously it's fictional, obviously it's imagined, but in some ways I think that the imagination can get to a truth that we can't get to from the historical documents. I want to stress, again, it's an imagined piece here, but I think it's really powerful. So the stanza in which Mary tells the story of being cut down after the hanging, I think is particularly effective at conveying this tone of defiance and glee. So I'm going to read a couple pieces from this. So this is from Atwood. When they came to harvest my corpse, open your mouth, close your eyes, cut my body from the rope, surprise, surprise, I was still alive. Tough luck, folks. I know the law. You can't execute me twice for the same thing. How nice. I fell to the clover, breathed it in, and bared my teeth at them in a filthy grin. You can imagine how that went over. Now I only need to look out at them through my sky blue eyes. They see their own ill will staring them in the forehead and turn tail. Before, I was not a witch, but now I am one. She's so good. So that's Margaret Atwood. So those are her final lines. They really sum up the story of Mary Webster best. Her Hadley neighbors made a witch out of her in their minds, and their actions only made her more powerful. In a community struggling to maintain order, safety, and sustenance, they easily fell victim to the worst superstitions. And in fact, their story was used by Mather to foment still more trouble in the Massachusetts colony, more anxieties about the devil in Massachusetts, eventually culminating in the Salem witch hysteria. So that was actually where this paper was going to end about a month ago, but if you'll bear with me and if you're still interested, I started rechecking some of my quotes just to make sure I had all my dates and everything was right here. And to my delight, so I worked on this research quite a number of years ago when I still lived out here, and to my delight I found out that some of the sources that I used were now digitized. So I could go back and look at them a little more closely and dig into them. They're now fully accessible online. This is a huge boon for someone working at a distance and lets me look up weird facts at all hours of the night and not just when the libraries and archives are open. So as a result, I'm delighted to say I have a little bit of breaking news that is new to this particular presentation of the story. I should note though that these details have always been in the record. I didn't find a new record, but I just hadn't gotten to these particular ones, which you always have to feel like when you're digging through history. I know I'm missing something, So Sylvester Judd actually mentions this case in a footnote, but I hadn't been able to follow up on it. Judd claims at the September court, 1680, Anne Belding, so 1680, this is 3 years before our Mary Webster case happens. So Anne Belding, a girl in her 16th year, daughter of Samuel Belding of Hatfield, was charged with purposes and practices against the body and life of Mary, wife of William Webster of Hadley. Judd notes, this is a strange affair and I cannot explain it. Okay, I can't explain it either, so I had ignored it because I had too many other things I was looking into. But with a little bit of recent digging, it's even stranger than Judd's note suggests. According to Hampshire County records, that's the thing that has been digitized that was much easier to access, in September of 1680, 3 years prior to Mary Webster's court case, a woman named Anne Belding was called to court, and so this is the court record now, quote, to answer for her most shameful and odious murdering purposes and practices on the body and life of Mary, wife of William Webster of Hadley. In court, Belding acknowledged her delinquency and was then ordered by the court. So we still don't know what exactly she did or what specifically happened, but she apparently acknowledges her delinquency, and she's ordered by the court, quote, to pay William Webster 20 shillings to satisfy him for his charges and trouble. So pause here. So she is going to have to pay Mary's husband for the charges and trouble, just a footnote. And though, to be whipped, this is Anne Belding, is going to be whipped with 13 lashes on the naked body, or to pay the county treasurer the sum of 4 pounds. Yes, that specified 13 lashes on the naked body. Luckily, though, for Anne, according to the record, her father, Samuel Belding Sr., quote, became engaged to pay the 4 pounds to the county treasurer. I would also note that the county itself benefited much more than the Websters from this arrangement, what with the county getting 4 pounds, and William Webster was going to get 20 shillings, which is 1 pound. Which seems, I'm not sure how to balance that inequality there. So apparently, Mary Webster was bewitched before she became a witch. What are we to make of this? As with the majority of cases in Salem, the Belding-Webster case fits with a pattern of women being both accused witches and victims of witchcraft. Just what Anne Belding was she up to, and what did she do to Mary? Did this incident contribute to an association between witchcraft and Mary Webster? What I find particularly confusing is that the court record refers to Mary as the victim and painting her in really kind of a sympathetic frame, right? Describes Anne Belding shameful and odious murdering purposes on Mary. How does Mary's reputation fall so far that by 1683, men are going to her house on a regular basis to beat her so that their horse carts can go past? How are we to square this image of Mary as a victim with her as the perpetrator? The records currently available do not provide answers to these and many other questions, though I feel sure that someone could write a really great or possibly terrible historical novel based on this, or a la Hamilton, perhaps a hit musical. Mary's story, like that of the Salem witches, is one that audiences love, and I'm delighted that people come out to hear about it. This never fails to get attention around Halloween. Students love I see a couple students here. Students usually love the witchcraft unit in their history courses. The entire city of Salem today is totally dependent on our love of witchcraft tales. But of all the witches I've read about, Mary Webster's is certainly my favorite. Mary Webster's story is really one of survival. Despite Anne Belding's attack, whatever form that took, despite regular beatings by strangers who just walked into her house, despite probably an attempted hanging, despite being disturbed, she survived. Her case today would be appropriately connected with the hashtag She Persisted, like a long line of impressive Massachusetts women down to this day. Mary Webster's story can be a lesson about persistence and survival. It is also a lesson about questioning and evaluating your sources, and figuring out how evidence can be put together to tell sometimes competing, sometimes conflicting stories. Mary Webster's story is disturbing, and should be disturbing to us, but it's clear that her story, like the woman herself, survived and persisted, and that's a very special kind of power. That's what I have for you today. Or hear from you? Thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I read somewhere that Cotton Mather was never remorseful for his role in the Salem witches trials.
He's not particularly my favorite. I have his picture. I'm not a big fan. Yeah, and Some people in Salem definitely came forward. Some of the girls came forward and made atonement publicly in church. They said that they had made things up. But Mather got a lot of power from using this. So yeah, he's a troublesome character to deal with.
And he's like the historian of the times.
Yeah. So he's the historian, he's the reverend, he's got all this power, and he really sets the narrative. It also tells you a lot of, the person who tells the story. He maintained control of that story in ways that in the 19th century we started maybe unearthing, and then now more 20th century readers and historians, 21st century readers and historians would certainly undermine Mather a lot, but he held sway well through the 19th century, that people really felt that this is history, this is what happened, not maybe using some of those critical thinking skills to dig into his perspective and what he had to gain from making sure that people were scared.
Wow.
Is there any idea where she lived in Hadley? Any idea?
No. Does anyone have this?
I heard West Street.
Yeah, I heard West
Maybe
Street.
it's
On the corner
Cemetery
of West Street and Cemetery Road.
Yeah.
West Street and Cemetery Road is what the crowd said.
It's on this side of Route 9, a couple blocks that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
God, we should go there.
On the common. It's right on the common.
Oh, okay.
On this side.
Yeah, it's close to the old road goes down to the cemetery.
Okay.
Didn't they call it a main highway or something?
Yeah, on the middle highway or
Middle?
something.
Okay.
She's next to the middle highway. is what that is.
Cemetery.
I know, right? This is Middle Street, so I'm.
Oh, maybe Route 9 was the middle highway because it's the middle of Massachusetts.
Oh, this was local students. Does she have a picture here? She puts it as West Street and Cemetery Road. I don't have a good accurate. I don't think this sign was there at the time. This is a lot. And this, what is the student's
There's
name?
a map
Do we
in
know the
there.
student's?
What book that I have?
Yeah.
Aurora Donta-Veman, I think. She did a project. If folks want to take a look and see that her.
No, that's John Webster.
John Webster.
And that was placed later by Noah Webster.
I was saying to someone beforehand, these candle molds, a lot of the other witch that I worked on is Mary Parsons, and she's the Northampton witch. And one of the things, she was constantly being accused of messing up people's candles, that they wouldn't set right. And I look at these and think, well, of course, like every third one was messed up, right? I get an idea of coincidence that keeps coming up, like this chicken fell in a pot, Mary had a skull, that's done. My yarn is really, really tangled today, and Mary walked by my house, right? These kinds of strange things. And you start to see a lot of confirmation bias, I suppose, like something bad or something inexplicable happened, you're looking for a way, and Mary just seems to be around a lot. In truth, she didn't have money. She may well have been walking around a lot in this community, maybe looking for food for herself, maybe seeking alms, perhaps. And so likely she was around and people weren't terribly nice about it. Yeah.
I don't remember hearing what you said. Was she widowed at this point?
No, her husband is still alive.
And do we know anything about him
No
in the
mention about
picture?
what William's doing at this point. He's a little bit older than her, but that is definitely one of the questions that I have. In some other cases, the men who were the partners of accused witches, they also became accused, but we don't see him come up in the records at all. So that's definitely one of my questions. Do you have a map?
This shows a map of West Street, and it shows, it says where William Webster lived and where Thomas Webster lived.
Perfect. This is out of Judd, right? So we can pass this around. I totally should have put this in here. There's the middle highway next to the meadow, and this is the William Webster, the tiny little house, and you can see there the full-size plots. Yeah, so that's a good one to look at. That's from Judd, I think, who is pretty helpful on that. Yeah.
So, curiously, I was at a birthday party last weekend where someone read this poem by Margaret Atwood.
At a birthday party?
It was a little bit of an odd moment.
Actually, it sounds like my kind of birthday party.
So she was giving the story. I never heard this before. I mean, I come here and I'm like, oh, this is weird. Talk about coincidence. But she said that after the hanging, and I don't know what sources she had, maybe it was Margaret Atwood conjecturing, that she was like a crazy person, and that people in town saw her as kind of like, off her rocker at that point. Now, we all speculated that one might be, given what had happened. But
I think that comes from Atwood's suggestion at one point, although it also seems seems a relatively logical suggestion, I would say. We don't have anything that remotely tells us that. We don't even have an actual person who said, oh, I heard that this from.
She was like a wandering homeless. I mean, that's how everyone in the group sort of thought it was. See how these things get spread?
Exactly,
So,
right. Yeah, we do. We still do this now. But yeah, we don't have any source that would help us to document that.
On the internet all the time.
Yes, there's lots of things on the internet that would support that.
Well, I'm glad to have the
Yeah.
verification that it wasn't necessarily the case.
And
so.
you know, all of Atwood's, I mean, she pins it to the Hutchinson case, which is the Hutchinson account, which again, we don't know. And the part about rolling her in the snow is also from Hutchinson. It's January in Hadley, there's probably snow. So those pieces hold up enough, but we just don't have that testimony. And what I would do for the secret diary of Mary Webster, that's hidden under a floorboard at that house, right, that we all dream of, but I'm afraid we don't have that.
But Judd said that Hutchinson was correct,
Yes.
so wonder what led
What leads him to think this? I agree.
closer to the hearing.
Yeah, so some of them think, well, this person was closer to the hearing of it, so it's more accurate, which I give some credence to. Maybe at the same time, it's really, really hard to pin that down.
Yeah, things have changed dramatically in my family, and we haven't even been through Hutchinson.
Right. I think there's so many lessons to learn from the story when you start pinning down all the different sources. It's a game of telephone over 300 years, right?
Right.
And there are details that we do know, right? And each of those has several questions around it, because it's so, the court details are so limited. Like, we know that these things happen, but without those we try to sketch things in, which is why we end up with poems about her, because I think we're just trying to fill in those blanks that we just don't have.
Wow. Well, apparently she dedicated the hanging still.
Yeah.
So,
Which, if you're watching now, and there's a scene of a hanging in it as well. It's yeah.
Seeing as Mary and William didn't have children, Atwood was probably from a brother or
Yes.
relative.
And Atwood has confessed that it's a kitchen story. When an interviewer specifically said, no really, what's the lineage? She said her grandmother told her this, so that too, who knows? I don't know of anyone who's gone through and done a genealogy to prove Atwood's connection. Oh wait, someone has! Late breaking!
I'm related to William Webster though, but
Okay.
that's why I'm here.
So you confirm? You can confirm?
Confirmed, yeah.
So you're related to Margaret Atwood too then?
Maybe.
Awesome. I don't know
Depending
which
on
one
how
you
the
were
lineage
excited
works,
about.
but-
Wow.
Yeah, but not Mary, but William.
Okay.
Through Mary.
Very, very cool. Margaret Atwood would like to know that. We should get that genealogy
Yeah, I
to
can
her.
send
We
her
will.
a chart.
That would be great. Great, thank you.
She say William or Mary's side? Atwood.
Atwood is on.
I don't know about
Oh,
Atwood,
oh.
but I know I'm on Williams. So.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't know
there
if it would
is
be
some-
helpful to her.
some
not to
descendants.
know.
It's interesting that today we want to reclaim our history. Like, I'm related to a witch. Like, that is not what people said back then. You can tell times have changed. Go ahead.
Do you have any explanation for the high rate of acquittals on the witchcraft cases before Salem? I wonder if there was a segment of society that was more skeptical of witchcraft in general, or whether they had standards of proof that weren't being met in these cases?
Absolutely, and if you will bear with me for 2 minutes while I give my little thesis on why everything changes in Salem. So things change massively in Salem, in part because the charter's been revoked. So they say, you know what, we don't know what to do in courts of law, so we are going to, for these special cases, declare a court of oyer and terminer. Have you heard this one before? Oyer and terminer is to hear and decide. They decide we are not going to follow our regular judicial practices. We are going to have a special court just for this. When this happens in history, folks, it is not good, right? Anytime we say we're going to suspend this judicial process that we've established for years, and what happens is they accept spectral evidence. So I'm sitting here and I say, you sent your specter after me, and the evidence of that is that you sent your specter after me. And that's all I have to say. When they accept spectral evidence, I could say anything about you that your specter did to me. They accept that as truth. And that, obviously, if that's your standard of evidence, of course people are going to be convicted. So a huge reason for the convictions in Salem, aside from lots of other dissent, it's a more complicated picture than that, but I would say a huge piece of why suddenly we have convictions in Salem is a change in the court procedure, and that's hugely important. I would also argue that leading up to Salem, there's a lot more skepticism. While every day you might say, oh, she's a witch, or oh, that's really creepy, when you get to a formal courtroom proceeding, it's held to a higher standard, right? The thing that you might believe as rumor in your community versus the thing that you believe in a court of law, I think we understand that even today, that we have different standards, and the courts at the time, in general, really weren't having it. It was very, very rare.
So Salem was like a backlash to say,
Many,
let's go back to the good old days.
Many things are
Oh,
changing
yeah.
there, right? Many things are changing in Salem.
Burial? Buried around here?
I don't know that we have a burial plot for her. I saw someone had claimed that she is in that, the lot with her husband, right? And is that, do we have a stone for her husband? With William in the Webster, in the old burying, is that what it's called here?
What's it called, the old cemetery?
The old Hadley cemetery.
The old Hadley Cemetery. That I've seen that. I haven't actually been there to check, and I don't know that her name is on it either, which would be. And she didn't have money, so presumably someone, perhaps a relative or the community would have had to pay for burial. But yeah, it's entirely possible that she's buried there with the family. But yeah. Anything else, folks? All right, well, you have the handout, and I think my email address is on the bottom if you have any questions. Or always glad to talk to someone about witches. And thank you so much for coming today. Be careful out there. Look out for witches or people who accuse people of being witches. I'm really glad to have everyone here.